Welcome to our fourth installation of this conversation about who we are in the image of God. I am Katie Lancaster. I think I know most of you guys. And today we are going to have Abbi Heimach-Snipes, who's my sister-in-law, and also Derek Dawson, who is one of the organizers at Chicago Roar, and they will both tell you more about what Chicago Roar is. I really love this work of thinking about what it means to be made in the image of God, and I keep seeing it everywhere. We were having some conversations with high school seniors this 2 weeks ago, and really questioning as they go off to college and to adulthood, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a young woman and a young man in this world, and how do they see themselves in the image of God? And a conversation with a young mother this about 2 weeks ago, she said, I didn't really think about God very much in my life until I had my children and saw how unique and different they were, and really started to think about how the way that each of them is growing into who they are is really a gift from God, that God has put this image of who they are into them. And so tonight, as we go into this work of thinking about race relations and about how we understand ourselves in relationship to God, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to continue that conversation. And Derek and Abbi will be a gift for all of us in this conversation. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Holy God, open our hearts. Let all anxiety fall from our shoulders. Make this space sacred, so that your love and generosity and tenderness might be present and accounted for in tonight's conversation. Give us the gift of an open mind, the gift of wisdom, the gift of grace. We dedicate this evening to your good work. In your holy name we pray. Amen. So as Abbi and Derek come forward, if you have questions, comments, ways that you want to participate in the conversation, I'll have the microphone. This is being live streamed and will be on YouTube later, so it'll help if people can hear your questions.
Thank you.
No, you've got.
I've got a mic. Can you hear me? Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this beautiful, beautiful, what I call the first spring day of the year. It is fantastic. I was at Fourth Presbyterian Church with Abbi earlier, and I walked past a flower bed and actually smelled the flowers, and it really shook me out of my winter stupor. So thank you for giving us your evening. My name is Derek Dawson. I am the co-program coordinator of Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism, or Chicago Roar. I'll say just a little bit about what Chicago Roar is. So there's a national organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training that's been around since about 1985. Crossroads was started by two Lutheran pastors in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America who thought back in the mid-1980s that something needed to be done to address systemic racism within the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And out of that work, the work grew around the country, and the Episcopal Church in Chicago and other parts of the country joined them. And then it grew to become an organization that was involving many, many denominations. And then people who come to church go to work, and they started taking the work to their organizations. And so about 10 years ago, the name of the organization changed from Crossroads Ministries actually, to Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. And then about 5 years ago, because we had a lot of work and were engaged with a lot of communities and organizations in Chicago, we thought that we would start a partner of Crossroads here in Chicago to work with organizations and institutions here locally. And at that time, I became the co-program coordinator. There are 3 of us in Chicago who are full-time staff, and we have a leadership team of about 17 people who are volunteers who help us do organizing and training as well. Abbi is one of those leadership team members. So that's how we got here. A little bit about myself. I am from Chicago. I actually grew up on the far south side of Chicago, around an area called Burnside, around 91st and University, if you know anything about the city. the far south side near where all the steel mills used to be, over southeast. I grew up in that neighborhood in a period of white flight. In fact, when my brother and I started kindergarten in that neighborhood, we were the only two African American kids at that school. And by the time we graduated from the 8th grade, there were no white kids left in the school at all. That's how quickly that neighborhood changed. I went on to go to high school, and after high school, I went to the University of Colorado at Boulder to study architecture. And my trajectory around race and racism started then, because in my first English class, a professor told me that he did not believe that I wrote an essay that I wrote, because he said he didn't believe a black boy from the south side of Chicago could write a paper of such quality. And he told me that if I had written that paper, that I could prove it to him by sitting down in front of him and writing another paper of the same quality in his office while he watched me. And the shameful part is that I did exactly that. It never occurred to me that I had a choice. So I sat down and wrote a paper of his on a topic that he chose. And through that experience, I actually changed my major to English and became a tutor in the English department, where my first job as an adult at the University of Colorado was tutoring. And the students I was tutoring were functionally illiterate African and American football and basketball players on the University of Colorado team. And so I left the University of Colorado and ended up in the Navy. I joined the Navy and became a broadcaster and journalist, and spent about 10 years overseas outside of the United States. I'll often say that if you want a clear understanding of race and culture in the United States, it can be very helpful to leave the United States. So I did that. I think I just lost my mic.
Yeah, it just turned as well.
Oh, there it is. So through a series of events, I ended up back in Chicago, where I went back to church. I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I decided to go back to church, and I went back to a church called St. Martin's Episcopal Church on the west side, where the priest at that church had a motto for the church, and it was linking spirituality with social justice. And he insisted that everybody who's a member of his church go to a Crossroads 2.5-day deep dive anti-racism training. I had no idea what that meant, but I went to the training, and it really transformed my life, because it made me think that maybe the problem with racism was not about an individual racist professor at the law firm, a professor at the University of Colorado. Maybe there was something about this systemic, institutional aspect of racism. Maybe it was less about the person and personalities and more about systems and institutions. So I started volunteering with Crossroads at that time, and to make a long story short, that's how I got here with you tonight. So that's a little bit about who I am and how I got here. And I'm going to ask Abbi to tell you a little bit about who she is, besides being Katie's sister-in-law. Abbi, please.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here. Is this better? It is such a gift and a joy to be with you all today. Move to over here? Okay. To share a little bit about me besides being related to Katie, and how I got involved with Chicago Roar and why it's one of my passions to be involved in organizing to dismantle racism. And right now I serve as a pastoral resident at Fourth Presbyterian Church, pastoring young adults. But before I got into this role, I grew up in a small town in Indiana, a very white community, a very homogenous community. And I didn't grow up thinking about my race, thinking that I was a white person, thinking that, in fact, I thought racism was something that had happened in the past, that ended during the 60s, during the civil rights movement. And that I knew about racists. I thought of like the KKK or incidences, racial incidences that happened connected to individuals. But I hadn't thought about or realized how I was connected in that system really until I went to college. And as Derek was just mentioning earlier about having an experience leaving the US to get a glimpse at the US, I had one of those experiences in college. I studied abroad in South Africa. And while I was in South Africa, I was learning about the history there, building relationships with people of color in South Africa, and starting to see some of the racial dynamics in South Africa. Right after apartheid, people were talking about race in ways that I wasn't used to in the United States. I noticed within myself starting to get a little judgmental towards some of the white people in South Africa, thinking, noticing the resource disparities between the community, the Zulu community that I was living in, and the place where I was doing some research at a church and connected with some other white folks there in the church. And I started thinking within myself, well gosh, when apartheid fell, if only they could have shared economic resources, and that really would have changed the dynamics, and we could have had racial equality, as if I was some kind of expert and knew how South Africa could have fixed their racial dynamics. But when I came back to the US, I started to notice just how similar I actually was to a lot of the white people in South Africa. And the similarities between US racial dynamics that are active and alive today also related to what was going on in South Africa. And that was so eye-opening for me. Growing up in a context where, because of my race, because of my privilege, I didn't have to think about the racial disparities in our context. Leaving the US had forced me to look at, I grew up in a context where I was totally excluded, or wasn't interacting with people of color, was not seeing what people of color were experiencing are experiencing in this world. And so I did a dive into learning more about power dynamics, and really saw ways that I am complicit and related in this system. I've been socialized in this system, which we're going to talk more about today, and noticed a real sense of call, connected with my faith and later my seminary education, to be a part of anti-racism organizing in the church. Because as you all have been talking some about the image of God and our call to see one another as related to and connected by, as all created beings by God, that this is part of our call. So that's a little bit about me. It's a little bit about Derek. And actually, I should get this back up. Let's see here. So whenever we have conversation, we're only talking for about an hour today, and normally Chicago Roar leads longer workshops, but whenever we have a conversation about race, we want to have a community agreement. How many of you have ever had a conversation about race that didn't go very well? So that's why, yes, me too. And so that's why we want to set some ground rules, a community agreement, to help us live into these conversations in healthier ways. So before, we used to talk about creating a safe space, but none of us can guarantee safety, and sometimes that can be confused with being comfortable. And these aren't very comfortable conversations, because we didn't necessarily grow up having these conversations all the time. So what we want to create is a courageous space where we can work on being brave together and digging deep. So included in this courageous space, we want to be respectful towards one another. And we need a respectful space to be able to have healthy conversations about race. We want to be listening to understand. I know sometimes if I'm hearing someone speak, I can start to think about what I'm going to say while other people are speaking. But we have time. Let's take time to actively listen to what folks are saying when we engage in conversation, and listen to understand what people are saying before we start talking. We want to take responsibility for what we say. Sometimes we can say things that can be offensive to other folks. So being able to take some responsibility for what we say, and again, listening to understand how something we might have said impacted another person. It's really important to be taking responsibility for what we say. And also, if you need to use the restroom or something, take care of yourself. You can get up and leave. That's fine too. So lots of ways that we can be taking responsibility for the ways we're participating together. We want to make room for diverse voices. Some of us have been socialized or grew up in contexts where we're really comfortable speaking in front of a large group. For other folks, it might be less comfortable. And some of us related to our identities, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's our sexuality, we might have been socialized to speak in different ways. So we want to just be conscious of if we're in a larger conversation together, and we might not have a whole lot of time to really dig into a large dialogue together, but we want to consider making room for diverse voices in our conversations together. Trusting ambiguity. Whenever we talk about race, I know for myself, I want the plan for how to fix racism so we can follow it exactly. And that's not, if we knew an exact plan, we might not have racism anymore today. So we just, especially since this is such a beginning conversation or a short conversation with the time that we have, I ask for you to trust the ambiguity. And if we get to a place, or maybe after this time together, we start having conversations and telling stories, just to remember to preserve the integrity of the story. That stories that we share belong to us, and if we have a sense where we want to share someone else's story, that we actually go to that person and ask permission to share that story and to talk about how we tell that story without just taking that story and telling it in whatever type of context. So these are some things that we really need to be able to participate in this conversation together, and have found that this helps create a more courageous environment. Are there any questions about this or things that you would want to add? Yeah.
When you refer to race, do you mean all races? African Americans and Hispanics and Asians?
Yeah, we're talking about all races. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but this was something that we just wanted to set into the space to create an environment for talking about race.
I would say, just to add to that, what Abby said is that it's a good question to ask, because particularly here in Chicago, in the Chicago area, we tend to look at race as a black-white issue, a black-white binary, and we are very clear that we're talking about two groups of people in the United States, white people and non-white people, and in all those non-white groups, we include all of the races that you mentioned. So thank you for asking the question.
Mm-hmm. So is this something we all can agree to for our time together? Great. Okay, move to the next. Oh, before I move to the next thing. So.
I'm gonna get these ready to hand out.
Oh, okay, great, thanks. So in learning about the series that you've all been having here, which has sounded so interesting, and want to pull on some of the biblical foundation and the theological foundation that you all have been talking about, of how do we, in our environment today, be working towards recognizing, valuing, acknowledging the image of God with one another, in our relationships, in our communities. And to transition us to be thinking about race, what about also the way we find ourselves in the images of God, or the images of Jesus that we see in our context? So I'm going to show some images of Jesus, and silently within yourself, notice what comes up for you, what feelings come up for you, what questions. Notice what comes up for you. just thinking within yourself. I'm getting ready to switch to the next slide. So before, I was showing some images of white Jesus, and here are some images of Jesus as a person of color from different races. And I know growing up as a white woman, I saw lots of images of white Jesus, blue-eyed Jesus, which is pretty amazing considering he was from Palestine. And with seeing Jesus like that, I could really connect to Jesus. I could relate to Jesus. Jesus wasn't somebody who was very different from me. And I wonder now, growing up in that context, how did that shape me? How did that shape my understanding of God or how I related to the image of God? Does it make it harder for me to see the image of God within people of color? And also to think what kind of impact that would have on people of color, too. To be always seeing those white images of Jesus. Because I know a lot of these images I don't see very regularly, whether it's in church or our larger culture. And so what impact does that have? What would it mean for me as a white person, too, to grow up in a context where I was regularly seeing images of Jesus as a person of color? How would that impact racial relationships? How would that impact our world?
And how might I have been influenced by growing up in church every Sunday, where every image that I ever saw of Jesus did not look like me or anybody I knew? What impact did that have on me?
And maybe you could relate to some of these questions. We're going to keep moving along, and at the end of our conversation, we hope to hear comments and questions, and would love to jump back to that. But before we dig deeper, if we're going to be talking about race, talking about racism, I think it's important to name and have a common definition of racism. There are lots of different definitions of racism out there, but this one is important to us. This is what Chicago Roar used, and we ask for our time together for you to try on this definition of racism. You'll also be getting a handout. So take a moment and just look at this definition. Race prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions equals racism. Just take a moment and look at that. Thank you. Could I have a copy of that? Thank you. Could I have someone read the first point below that definition? The first point there. Thank you.
Racism is more than race prejudice. It is more than individual attitudes and actions.
Thank you. Could I have
Racism is the collective actions of a dominant racial group.
Could I have someone read the third point?
Systemic power turns race prejudice into racism.
And the last point?
Racial prejudice becomes racism when one's group racial prejudices are enforced by the system and institutions of a society to be tolerant of prejudice based on race to a group in power and limiting on the use of the racial groups that are not in power.
I'm wondering if for the live stream we should use that mic real quick. It's okay. I'd love to hear now what, from reading those points, from seeing this definition, what do you notice? What sticks out to you?
It's dividing people. It's dividing people into us and them, or us and others. If you think of race as a cultural construct that separates people, when you think about it, we all pray to the same God, regardless of what other people, other cultures think he looks like.
Yeah, so race is something that has divided us. Other things that you notice. Are you saying something? I don't want to cut you off if you were trying. Yeah. Oh, okay.
It looks like it's me. In other words, I don't consider I'm racist, but I'm part of a system. So I'm part of the problem.
Yeah, that's what's something about this definition. If, like what I was sharing about my story growing up, I thought racism was just the race prejudice part that really focuses on the individual. But by the connecting with the misuse of power by systems and institutions, it shows that we're all complicit and we're all part of this because we all relate to systems. We all have to interact with systems and institutions as we go about our lives. But what's different about racial prejudice, or what's different about making this into racism, is that if we only focused on race prejudice, the goal would be to become innocent and not involved. But when seeking to learn about how power is being used in systems and institutions, the more we understand, the more we can strategize together to interrupt the way power is misused. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I just had a comment, which is that, to me, I mean, what's concerning, I think, to a lot of people is the fact that if you don't feel like you're prejudiced, but you engage in some institution where there is racial prejudice apparent, you kind of get dragged along,
Yeah.
and you're part of that. You're complicit with it if you don't do something. But it doesn't just come out of the system or the institution out of nowhere. It comes from people who are racist, who are creating policies and procedures within that institution to affect their own views. So people who are not racist have to actively do something about that.
Yeah, so something that, so we all have prejudices. We all have biases. People of color do, white people do. We all have prejudices because we grow up in environments where we learn particular things about our way of life. But what makes it racism, because we're assuming that we're all complicit in this system, what makes it racism is where the power is. And I also want to clarify that misuse of power, it can be both intentional, it can be both intentional and unintentional. But looking at where the power is, how the policies, how the procedures are made, that's the link for making racism happen. But we don't find it productive to be pointing out who's racist, who's not racist, because the point is looking at the systems and institutions. And yes, as individuals, we play a part of those systems and institutions. It's important to be looking at the prejudices that we have learned in our lives and how can we be working to shift them? How can we be working to better value the image of God present in each of us? That's important. That plays a role. But what does it look like to be complicit in these systems? And how can we be looking at them, seeking to understand and dig deeper? Is there anything else you would like to add, Derek?
I think why don't you cue up the video, and then I will transition to the video that we're going to see.
Okay, great. So this video yeah, we'll
So
be.
what we want to do now is we want to continue this conversation by pulling out that part about race, because what you were saying about race divides us is so important, and it also begs the question: what race are you? If I were to ask you what race are you, what would you say? You would say white. How do you know you're white? I mean, look at the paper. That paper is white. Are you the same color as the paper?
I'm classified as white
You're classed by whom?
by the government.
By the
who makes
government?
those decisions.
What race am I? What race is Abby? Could Abby be that skin color and be black? Could she be Latino? Could she be Native American? So, what does it mean? I think I heard you say race is a social construct, right? Money is also a social construct. Does money have meaning? The fact that race is a social construct, does that deny the fact that it has very real power over our lives? It does have very real power over our lives, doesn't it? Sure. And so we need to understand a little bit about how race came to be in the United States, what it means, and what kind of power it has. Yes?
But a lot of people are very proud of their races.
Absolutely.
And, you know, if you're Irish or if you're, oh gosh, it's not that good. I say it's just, are you sure this is on?
It's on.
Now I've forgotten my train of thought.
So I think you were saying that people are proud. People are very proud of their
if you're
race.
proud of your heritage, why
Right.
deny it?
Right.
But, well, come back to me in a minute. I'm
Okay.
going
Well,
to
and
frame my thoughts better.
I think your point is very well taken. People should be proud of their race. There's nothing wrong with being white or African American, etc. And so but it's helpful to understand where race came from, because the reality is that even if I am proud of my race, that doesn't stop me from being treated differently because of my race. That becomes the issue. So that power part of the definition becomes the issue. Whether we have racial pride or not, that's not the problem. But where does the institutional power come from to deny some rights based on their race and grant rights and privileges to others based on their race? Yes.
I do think it's helpful to understand the distinction between race and ethnicity.
Yes, thank
where you may have pride in your ethnicity, not so much your race.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And what you were starting to name about some ethnic groups, in this country we know that several of those groups that you may have mentioned, like Irish, were not always white in this country. The Irish became white through a process. Jews became white through a process. There's a very well-known book called How the Jews Became White Folk by a woman named Karen Brodkin, who chronicles this. The Irish were not white. You remember the signs? No Irish, no blacks need apply. But some folks were able to become white through a period of time. Why do they become white? Because being white in the United States gives you access to resources that being a person of color does not have. And so the ethnicity gets into this melting pot, and that's exactly what we're going to see in this video. So I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll watch the video, and then we'll come back and see what other comments or questions the video might elicit. Yes?
Just a quick comment. I'm really excited when I see a mixed racial couple, and I think in time, we're just not going to even know what race anybody is because we'll have so many beautiful blends, and another generation will be another blend, and I love that.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this other video also. I would ask you to consider one thing about that. So in this country, let's look at somebody that you all may know. A man who's of mixed race. His mother was white and his father was African American, right? His name was Barack Obama. He was a mixed race person. He was the president of the United States. Do you think he was treated very differently because he was a mixed race person? So the reality is that in the United States, we have this history of this thing called the one-drop rule and blood quantum, which one-drop rule said that if you have one drop of black blood, that you are black. which unfortunately counters the argument that you're making, which is something that we would all hope. We would all hope that even without mixing of the races, that we would all be accepted as equal. The problem is mixing races actually creates more brown folk, and brown folk are treated just as badly as black folk in this country. So let's watch the video. It's only about 12 minutes long. It's from a video series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. This is part of part 3, which is called The House I Live In. It was produced by an organization called California Newsreel. And it's gonna help us understand race as a social construct, but also race as a political construct and a legal construct. So take a look at the video and we'll have a conversation on the other side. Abby, thank you, Abby.
Thus fully American. By 1910, a new term was entering popular culture to describe the transformation of Europeans. The phrase came from the title of a Broadway play by Israel Zangwill. God, said Zangwill, would melt down the races of Europe into a single pure essence, out of which he would mold Americans.
So when the Irish, when Germans, when Italians were coming and they didn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, the idea was they will assimilate into Americanhood. They will become American, which in the American tradition has meant white American. But that melting pot never included people of color. Blacks, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, etc. could not melt into the pot. They could be used as wood to produce the fire for the pot, but they could not be used as material to be melted into the pot.
Whiteness was key to citizenship. In 1790, Congress had passed an act declaring that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. After the Civil War, naturalization was extended to persons of African descent as well. But it was the white citizen who had clear access to the vote, sat on juries, was elected to public office, and had better jobs. Whiteness was not simply a matter of skin color. To be white was to gain the full rewards of American citizenship.
In order to be a naturalized citizen in this country, you had to be categorized as white or black. And almost everybody who tried to naturalize, all but I think one case that went to the Supreme Court, all of them were people trying to be categorized as white. So the court had to make decisions about who was white and who was not.
Courts and legislators had long been in the business of conferring racial identities. In the South, to enforce Jim Crow segregation and laws against mixed marriages, courts had to first determine who was black under law.
And here's where it really gets interesting. You got some places, for example, Virginia law defined a black person as a person with 1/16 African ancestry. Now, Florida defined a black person as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. Now, Alabama said, you're black if you got any black ancestry, any African ancestry at all. But you know what this means? You can walk across a state line and literally, legally change race. Now, what does race mean under those circumstances? You give me the power, I can make you any race I want you to be, because it is a social, political construction.
In 1909, American courts had that power. That year, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Massachusetts ruled that Armenians, often classified as Asiatic Turks, were legally white. If Armenians could be designated white, what of the other so-called Asiatic races? Filipinos, Syrians, the Japanese. Could they also petition successfully to be designated white by the courts and thus become Americans? In 1922, when Japanese businessman Takao Ozawa petitioned the Supreme Court for naturalization, many in the Japanese community believed his was the perfect test case.
Takao Ozawa came from Japan, went to the University of California at Berkeley for a few years, then moved to Hawaii where he had a family, and he applied to become a naturalized citizen in 1915.
My father wrote his own brief and everything, and he was really devoted. He wanted to become an American citizen, and nothing would stop him. He was determined.
Japanese growers in California watched Ozawa's case closely. By 1920, a series of alien land acts prohibited many non-citizens from owning or leasing land. Without a legal designation of whiteness to make them citizens, Japanese immigrants could not have the full protection of American law, no matter how long they lived in the country. In his brief, Ozawa argued that his skin was as white as any so-called Caucasian, if not whiter. But he made a much more important second argument.
But a second argument was that race shouldn't matter for citizenship. What really mattered was a person's beliefs.
My honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was an American, but at heart he was a traitor. In name, I am not an American, but at heart, I am a true American.
The articles would come out in the paper. I thought, oh, what did he do? You know, I thought only bad things came out in the paper, and I was kind of ashamed, you know, when I was a child. And it was just the way we were brought up. I didn't have any Oriental friends. My neighbors were all Caucasian. And so he was so determined to get us, well, when the time came to be American citizens.
The Supreme Court ruled that Ozawa could not be a citizen. They said he was not white within the meaning of the statute and therefore not eligible to citizenship. And the court said, well, he's not white because he's not Caucasian, and Caucasians are whites. He did everything right. He learned English. He had a lifestyle that was American. He went to Christian church on Sunday. He dressed as a Westerner. He brought up his children as Americans. He did everything he was supposed to do. And yet he's told that he can't be a citizen because he's not white.
The court ruled that according to the best-known science, Ozawa was not Caucasian, but of the Mongolian race. But the court would not be bound by science in policing the boundaries of whiteness. Only 3 months after Ozawa, the court took up the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian immigrant and U.S. Army veteran who petitioned for citizenship on the grounds that Indians were of the Aryan or Caucasian race, and therefore white.
And he makes the scientific argument, having learned something actually from the Ozawa case, that he is Caucasian. He gets scientific authority to speak on his behalf, that in fact South Asians are included in the Caucasian race.
So here the court was in a bind because they were presented with so-called scientific evidence that Indians were Caucasian. And the court solved this problem by saying that it didn't matter what science said, so-called science. They actually said white is not something that can be scientifically determined, but white is something that is subjectively understood by who they called the common person, the common man.
It may be true, reasoned the court, that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today. The same court that used science to determine whiteness in Ozawa 3 months before now refuted its own reasoning in Thind. Thind might well be Caucasian, the High Court said, but he was not white. The justices never said what whiteness was, only what it wasn't. Their implied logic was a circular one. Whiteness was what the common white man said it was.
The court often decided who was white and who wasn't based on whether they just felt that the person would politically fit well into the kind of society that we were trying to build. And sometimes it was pretty explicit that this is what the court was doing.
There was widespread racial views that Asians were undesirable, that they threatened to contaminate the American society. Basically, that Asians are too different, that they can't ever really become like the rest of us.
The consequences of the unanimous verdict in U.S. versus Thind were catastrophic for the Indian community. South Asians who had naturalized before the verdict were stripped of their citizenship and property. Vaishno Das Begai was a successful merchant who fled British tyranny in India to raise his family in a free country. After his American citizenship was revoked, he took his own life. He left a suicide note for his family and another for the public. But now they come and say to me I am no longer an American citizen. What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. We cannot leave this country. Humility and insults, blockades this way, and bridges burned behind.
And thank you. We're going to stop the video there. And so we shared this video with you again to re-emphasize the definition. Race prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions equals racism. Race prejudice is not the same as racism. So what are your thoughts? We've got a few minutes left. We'd like to hear your thoughts on the definition, the video, whatever else may be on your mind. Abby, do you have the mic?
It seems so much harder to battle a system than an individual's person's own prejudices. I feel like I can, I have, in fact, talked to people one-on-one about what I perceive to be, racial misunderstanding. But it seems when it's the Chicago Police Department or it's law enforcement in general, who I, want to love and support, or when it's a school system, a movement toward charter schools instead of broadening public education, these things that are hurting people racially. These are much harder to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I would absolutely agree. The other side of that, though, is that if you convert an individual to not be racist, they will have influence over people in their sphere. But think about the influence that the police department has over people's lives. So if an African American kid gets shot by the police, then what we often do is try to figure out, was that police officer a racist? And then we try to look for that bad apple and get rid of that bad apple. The problem is that it's the tree that's sick. And that sick tree will continue to produce bad apples unless we don't solve the problem at its root. how do we find the way, how is the police department training its recruits? How are they investigating the background of its recruits? Who are they hiring in the first place? Are they protecting each other? Do the police, instead of saying, we need to get rid of these bad apples, does the department surround them, right? And that's why, you're absolutely right, it's much more difficult. I'm hearing feedback, I'm not sure whether it's me or...
I think it's just rubbing your shirt.
Oh, okay. So I would agree with you, it is absolutely much harder. Now, there are groups of people who have expertise in how to dismantle systemic racism. That is, in fact, what Crossroads in Chicago Word does. We help institutions with the tools and techniques and experience about how to do that. And what that means is, how do you look at the policies, the hiring policies, the practices, so that you can get at the root of the problem, and then the individuals who may be racist don't have as much influence, and eventually will leave. Because I think what you said is very true. A lot of times we get our racism and those personal prejudices from the institutions themselves. It's the institutions that tell us that these folks are bad because of power, right? By saying that these Indian folk are not white, do not deserve citizenship, we're also communicating a message that those Indians are less than white people. That's where the racism comes from, and it's coming from the system. If we don't act at the systemic level, then we'll never get all the individuals, because the systems will keep reproducing them.
Derek, I would also include theologically speaking, you know, I'm Presbyterian, and that we talk about how we're all broken, how we all participate in sin. But sometimes within this culture, I know I can get caught up with, have heard one of our colleagues talk about this tyranny of goodness, that I want to be good, I want to be perfect, I don't want to be associated with being complicit in racism. But when learning that we're all complicit and that we're all part of this broken system, and being human as made by God, we mess up in ways. There's something freeing about, oh, this is going to be a journey that we're all going to be making mistakes, and that we're not going to be perfect. There's something freeing about that as well too, and that it's not all on one person to fix and save. That this is something that we're working on together, which is what I think God is calling us to doing as well, of working towards the kingdom of God on earth.
Thank you. By the way, it's not mine, so I'm not sure.
I just turned this off, now it's back on. Okay.
If you could wave a magic wand right now, what would the United States look like?
Wow. That's for Abby, right? If I could wave a magic wand right now, I'd go back to what you just said. That everybody could be proud of their race and be fully who they are. Is there a way that I can be proud of my race without having to put yours down? Can I be proud of my race without thinking that my race is superior? Can I see each other as equal under the eyes of God and each other? That's what my magic wand would do. And then we would all be free to live freely and create and love God the way we're designed to do, without racism destroying all of our humanity and destroying any possibility of having authentic relationships with each other. Mm-hmm. I think God has waved his magic wand. We just have not followed his directions. Mm. I think we have the answers. We are made to live in community with each other. Racism, I believe, is making that impossible to happen. And until we address racism at the systemic institutional level, we will never be able to live into our full humanity as God has designed.
Amen.
There are institutions in the United States today, or even in predominantly white countries throughout Europe, etc., that actually have become race blind. And who are they, or can you name some?
I'm sorry, I cannot.
Yeah.
I don't think they exist. But I would also say that becoming race blind is not necessarily the goal. France, as a matter of fact, tried to do that. France has made it illegal. You know how we have the census where you check the boxes? France has made that illegal. Now, does that mean racism no longer exists in France? Right? The reason we check the boxes, the reason why the being aware of race, first of all, if we erase the boxes, then that means subtly that we're telling people of color and white people that we shouldn't be proud of our race. I have no shame in being African American. The problem is not with my race or my skin color. The problem is that I am treated differently than other folks. The problem is that white folks have been socialized to act in ways that indicate that white folks are superior to other people. That is just as damaging to white people as it is to people of color. Yes. One, because it's a lie, and two, because it separates white folk from all of humanity. And then there are also very practical reasons. When you think about how some white folks are coerced and tricked into voting against their own interests, right? For the first time in history, I'm learning that white men, the age to which white men are living, is actually becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. Right, because this racism does not just impact people of color. It's damaging to everybody. Think about what it does to relationships and the ability to be free and comfortable and love, right? It's not good for anybody. So the question is not how do we become race blind? How can I notice your race and respect it as a difference without seeing one race superior to the other? That's Yeah, I think we're still working on it, and I have friends and colleagues who do this work all over the country, and countries are in different places on the spectrum, but these are relatively new conversations. Remember, it wasn't very long ago. Apartheid ended some 20 years ago. The civil rights movement keeps happening, so things are improving, but it takes all of us in all of our institutions, including our churches, to get involved at a very real level. As long as we in our institutions sit back and wait for it to happen and pray that it happens without putting our feet and our bodies behind it, it's unreasonable to think, how's it going to happen if we're not actively involved?
I just have to get my 2 cents in. I don't have a magic wand, but I will say that the place to start is requiring a discussion, and that video and what you guys are doing right now is required in all high school curriculums or somewhere in the education system to open that discussion. That's what I think is maybe a little stick, and it will turn into a magic wand someday.
Yes, and I would add Sunday schools to that education.
Yes, thank you. In the movie it mentioned Americans. Is that a starting point?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. In
the movie, a couple times it mentioned Americans. Mm-hmm. Is that a starting point for exclusivity or inclusivity?
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Abby, can you answer?
Oh, yeah.
I'm guessing that maybe Ralph is saying that what I was going to say, if I'm right or wrong, that it's healthy for us as Americans, white-skinned Americans, to be in a different position where we are in a country where, say, people are all African American and we are the minority. I think this is very healthy for us.
It can help, but I have to say, around the world, Abby mentioned South Africa. I've spent time in South Africa also. The question isn't about demographics. So we often hear that sometimes it's 2046, sometimes in the future, that the United States will be a majority Latino country, that Latinos will outnumber whites. Do you think that will cause things to change in the United States?
They already outnumber whites in the city of Chicago.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nothing has changed because it's not about demographics, as the video said. It's about power. Who controls the resources? Who controls the access? And so a minority with power, money, access, history, guns, can control a majority population any day, and we have history all over the world of that. Chicago is a good example, right? So unfortunately, demographic changes do not necessarily have an impact unless there's a power shift, and unless folks sort of are able to think about equality and letting go of power and other people having more power, shared power, decentering what's considered, and an attitude that says we do not have to continue to rank ourselves as human beings as superior and inferior. But that takes some real acknowledgement that we do that in the first place.
And I don't know if this was also part of what you were asking about, like, where did some of this begin? Some of the other trainings that we do go a lot deeper into the history of race in the U.S. and how race became a part of our culture and context. And also, just to give a little plug, at Fourth Presbyterian Church, we're hosting the 2.5-day training that Derek mentioned earlier that really does dig in deep to this history, and also some concrete strategies for working within our institutions to organize to dismantle racism. That training is coming up Memorial Day weekend, Thursday evening, all day Friday, all day Saturday. And so if you're interested, you can talk to me and we can register.
Abby and I will be here for a few minutes if you have any questions. I see that you all have been very generous because it's after 8 o'clock and you all haven't thrown anything at us or run out, so I appreciate your time. I'm sorry we didn't have more time. We're welcome to come back if you'd like to continue the conversation. It's a beautiful Monday evening, and we are so grateful that you gave some of us your evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, and I hope you will take a moment to talk with Abby or Derek if you've got time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I have